The Legend of Andrew, the Eyeless Killer. How it began. My name is Andrew Summers. I have lived for years as a killer whom is known as the Eyeless Smile. I will now explain why and how that came to be, from beginning to end. My mother was in the hospital ready to give birth to her child. She was the wife of Charles Sanders. Everyone knew Charles, the famous judge. After giving birth to her child, my mother was resting and the nurse walks out of the room to get Mr. Charles. Mr. Charles, you may want to see this, she said. What is it that I need to see? Why not tell me now? The nurse gulped and said, well, you see, your son is a bit special. Charles stood up and asks, what do you mean by that exactly? He followed the nurse to the room and he looked at the child. His facial expression instantly changed upon seeing his son. What is this? He shouted furiously. The child was a boy. It had singed black hair, one blue eye and one golden eye color. His skin was as white as snow, and his fingertips were claws. This isn't a child, this is a monster. Charles shouts. The nurses that helped with the birthing looked down in embarrassment. The next day, I woke up in my mother's arms, so I looked up at her, said Mum. She flinched in surprise upon hearing me talk at such a young age and she smiled. Suddenly, my father walked in and gouged out my right eye. My mother screams in fear as blood poured from the socket. I was filled with rage and my body began to grow to about maybe 10 inches. As I towered over him, my hand grabbed my stolen eye and shoved it down his throat. I said, if you ever try that again, it'll be your eye that gets ripped out. I pulled my hand out of his mouth and walked up to my fearful mother and lay in her lap as a smaller child once again, and fell asleep. As I began to wake up, I noticed that I was no longer home. It looked like I was at a psychological hospital. Mother? I asked weakly. No answer, all I heard was muffled voices. So I looked across the room and I saw my mum and dad being murdered by a man with a blue mask that had blood leaking from its eye sockets. I tried to change forms but I couldn't. All I was able to do was cry. Well, it would seem that you're awake now, he said in a deep, creepy voice. He picked me up and said, the name's Eyeless Jack, there'll be more guards so I need your help. Andrew sheds a tear and changed forms. He now towers over E.J. and said, if you have somewhere to take me, and orders to follow, I will gladly follow you. Suddenly a bullet hits Andrew's other eye, so he ripped it out and a red glowing dot appeared from it. Andrew and EJ began to fight their way out of the building, however. Andrew did most of the fighting. Hey Eyeless. I'm feeling a bit, tired, Andrew said as he fell into Jack's arms, turning into a toddler and sleeps. Jack smiled and picked up Andrew, bringing him to the slender woods. Andrew yawned and stretched before opening up his eyes. Where are we? He asks. Jack puts Andrew down and began chanting a spell. Andrew stood up and saw a portal suddenly open. Let's go, Black Sun, Jack says as he walked through the portal. Andrew followed him and said, Black Sun? Jack nods and says, your eyes reminds me of two suns, the black sun that is here, and the sun out there. Andrew nodded and said, you may have a good point, as he walked next to EJ. Eventually the two arrived at a mansion. Jack says, welcome home Andrew, welcome to Slenderman's mansion. Andrew looked up at it and said, wow, it's amazing, but why am I here? He asks. Suddenly a tall faceless man walks up to him and said, good work Jack, you can go inside now. EJ nods and walked inside. You're Andrew, correct? He asked. Andrew nods as he covered his eyes. Slenderman bends down and asked, "Did something happen to your eyes?" Andrew nods and says, "Yeah. My father gouged out my right eye, and my left eye got shot with a bullet." Andrew uncovered them and asks, "Could you fix them?" Slenderman said, "There is one way to let you see again, but it'll be very painful." Andrew smiled widely and said, "No matter how painful it is, it'll never compare to the pain that my dad has caused me. Do it." Slenderman nodded and brought Andrew inside. As they walked in, Andrew saw a lot of killers inside looking at him. However, one of them said, "Bringing kids into your home, Slendy?" Andrew snarls, "Kids? No, I'm actually older than all of you, all but one." The one who asked flinched upon hearing just how deep my voice was. It seems like the one who asked is none other than Jeff the Killer. Slenderman walked me up the stairs and laid me on a table, locking the door. Andrew took off his bandages and said, "Let's begin." Slenderman nodded and strapped him to the table, restraining any and all movements. After hours of surgery, Slenderman unstrapped Andrew and woke him up. "All done, take a look." As he handed Andrew a mirror. As he looked at himself, he smiled and saw that his mouth had a carved smile on it, but his eyes were now constantly bleeding just below the sockets. He looked at Slenderman in confusion and said, "What happened to my mouth?" Slenderman said, "I used Jeff's blood and Jack's DNA to complete the operation. You should look at your eyes carefully." He looked at the mirror again and saw that his eyes had turned completely black and had red on one side and gold on the other for pupils. After seeing his new look, Andrew walked downstairs and changed forms. After seeing his new look, Andrew walked downstairs and changed forms. "Ha guys, I can see once again, but only. I can see 3 times better." Ben, Jeff, EJ, Luna, Jane, Tisai Toby, all said that's good black-eyed blood. Andrew looked at them curiously and asked, "Black-eyed blood?" "No, I'm the eyeless cannibal." Everyone's eyes widened and they asked, "Cannibal?" Andrew nods and says, "Yes, cannibal. You see. I shall explain it in short. Before I was brought here, my dad ripped out my right eye out of blind rage. So I shoved it down his throat and began to eat his flesh. Geez, you just might be worse than me." Jeff shouts in sarcasm. Andrew laughed sarcastically and replied, "Nah, no one's worse than you, Jeffy." Jeff laughed and said, "You're right." Andrew nodded and said, "Darn right I am." Then Sally walked downstairs and asked, "Who are you?" As she rubbed her eyes. "That's Andrew," a voice said from the door behind Andrew. It was a girl with a very white-colored skin and beautiful blue eyes. "The name's Luna. I see that you've been saved by my brother." She looked over at EJ. "Well, I say brother, but he's actually my cousin," she added. Andrew nods and felt a tug on his cloak. "Wanna play?" Sally asked. Andrew looked at her for a moment, then said, "Of course. Let's play together, Sal." She smiled wisely and jumps onto Andrew's back. He walked upstairs and said, "Which room, Sal?" She points to the first room on the right. They entered and Andrew sat her down on the bedside. Sally pulled out a fairly decent-looking dollhouse and said, "Draco helped me build this. Will you play with me, Andrew?" He asked Draco. That name sounds oddly familiar. "Anyways, of course I will, Sally." She smiled and hugged Andrew. After a few hours of playing with Sally and watching movies with her, Andrew walked out of the room, stretches and walked downstairs. Suddenly Slenderman's voice said, "You seem tired. Get some rest and come see me when you get up." Andrew nods and walks to an empty room, laying down on a bed and falls asleep. 11:25 p.m., Andrew woke up and saw Luna sitting on the foot of the bed. "So, you finally woke up. "Good," she said with a wide smile. Andrew looked at her and said, "What are you doing in here, Luna?" She giggles and said, "Slendy wants to see you right away. You'd best hurry." Andrew nodded, rubbing his eyes, and stretched before rushing downstairs quickly. Slenderman grabs Andrew and pulled him into his office. "It would seem that those whom kept you imprisoned have somehow managed to find their way in here." Andrew's eyes widened and he said, "If they want me, they can have me." Slenderman asks, "You don't mean?" Andrew cut him off saying, "Send support to free me in exactly 5 days." Andrew then walks out of the office, grabbed a butcher knife and walked outside. He stabbed the closest human in the heart and began to eat his flesh. The other human soldiers yelled, "Surrender now or we will shoot you." Andrew stood up and surrendered. The troops took his blade away, and cuffed him. They took Andrew through the portal and closed it. "Andrew!" "No!" Sally yelled from her window, with tears streaming down her face. Luna was crying next to Sally. Then the two walked downstairs to Slenderman and asked, "Why did he do it? Why?" Slendy answered, "Because he wanted to protect us all, especially the both of you. We'll save him in 5 days, his request," he adds. Sally hugs Luna, and the two cry together. After a 3, maybe 4-hour transport, Andrew had arrived at the Morningtide Asylum. As the guards threw Andrew out of the car, they chained him and brought him inside. They pulled out his profile and matched it to him. "It's a match. Put him into his cell," the warden says as the guards brought Andrew in the building and unchained him. They threw him into a cell and locked him in it. Later that night, Andrew was staring in the mirror when he heard a voice from across the hall ask, "You've been staring at the mirror all day, why?" Andrew glared at the person and smiled. "1 day down. 4 to go. I sense a sudden fear coming from you. Why?" The person replied, "I wouldn't fear you. You're so darn creepy looking." "My name's Sky." Andrew creepily laughed and said, "Mine's Andrew. An, for short." Sky shivered in fear and said, "See ya in the morning." His light went out and Andrew said, "Night, Sky," and fell asleep standing up. "All right everyone, up and at 'em, you know where to get breakfast. Those who aren't hungry just stay in your cell." The guards yelled as the lights turned on. Andrew stayed in his cell and began biting himself, eating his own flesh since he can't eat regular food. "No worries, it heals almost instantly," he says in his mind. After about 2 hours pass by, the guards walked into Andrew's cell and cuffed him. Time for interrogation. Eyeless smile. They dragged him through the halls because Andrew refused to walk, much less talk. They uncuffed him after throwing him into a chair in an isolated room, with the interrogator on the opposite side. "Why do you kill your father, boy?" the man asks. Andrew gives no answer, only a crooked smile and a terrifying look before punching clean through the wall, causing his hand to grab the man's heart and rips it out. He began to eat the heart. The guards shot taser shots at Andrew, but to no avail. Andrew began eating them. But the alarm was going off. Upon hearing it, Andrew climbs up the wall and waits for more food to arrive. After a group of 4 guards walked inside, a drop of blood drips from Andrew's mouth. The guard feels of it and looked up. He didn't see anything though. Andrew had camouflaged himself with the ceiling. He quietly pulled out the guard's silenced handgun and shot the 4 guards before camouflaging himself again. Suddenly Andrew felt his heart area and noticed that he'd been sniped there. He pulled out his heart and began eating it, throwing the bullet on the ground. Andrew's heart began reforming itself as the wound healed. Andrew began to feel drowsy, so he felt his neck only to find a knockout dart in it. He fell to the ground unconsciously. Andrew woke up in a white room, tied up by white restraints. He was far too weak to break free immediately, so he sat there for hours, until he regained his strength. The security camera that was watching him was jammed and multiple explosions was heard throughout the asylum. Andrew smiled and broke free from his restraints. He headed towards the door and punched his hand through it, picking the lock and heads to Sky's cell. He ripped the door open and said, "Sky, if you want to be free, come with me." Sky nodded and jumped onto Andrew's back. Andrew was surprised by this and said, "What are you doing?" Sky smiled and said, "Let's go." Andrew sighed and told her to hold on tight as he began jumping wall from wall at incredible speeds. Eventually, they reached the control room and freed all the other people. "Kill 'em all for treating us like dogs," Andrew yelled through the megaphone after triggering the alarm on purpose. The cellmates thanked Andrew and Sky for freeing them and ran to kill the guards, taking the keys to the armory and taking weapons to fight with. Andrew and Sky were on the rooftop looking at the city. "Andrew?" a voice said from behind him. Andrew put Sky down and hugged Sally. Suddenly Luna walked up to Andrew and said, You had me worried sick. Do you understand what you put me through, Andrew?" Andrew had a terrified expression on his face but was suddenly kissed by Luna. His eyes widened but he kissed her back. Sky looked at Andrew in jealousy. Andrew looked at Luna and she nods. So Andrew walked up to Sky and kissed her too. She blushed and kissed back. Andrew pulled back and asked satisfied Sky. She nods and said, "Sky is just another nickname, my true name is Alexandra, but you can call me Alex." Andrew nods and said, "Let's go home." Calmly. So the three went back to Slender Mansion and went to bed. Jeff woke up Andrew and said, "Who the hell is this? And why is she here?" Andrew was still asleep but answered Alex, "When she wakes up, bring her to Slendy for me, will ya?" Jeff sighs and puts his knives away and said, "Fine, but what do I tell him?" Andrew answered, "Tell him to come find me." Jeff nodded and left the room quietly. As the sun was beginning to rise, Andrew walks to the kitchen and began cooking a full meal for everyone. Jeff and EJ walked in the door from their nightly kills and smelled something good. So they walked into the kitchen and saw what Andrew was making. Andrew said, "You're here, good." Jeff and Jack nodded and sat down to rest. Alex and Slenderman walked inside the kitchen and asked, "That smells delicious, did you need me for something, Andrew?" He nods and said, "Yes, I need you to get someone to help her awaken her true powers and form." Slendy nodded and said, "Okay, will do." Andrew thanked him and puts his special meal on the table. "Bon appetit," he says as he stood back. Everyone began eating and said, "It's amazing, but why aren't you eating?" Andrew said, "Thanks, I can't eat regular food, only flesh and organs." They nodded and was about to ask why that is, and he said, "Because I'm cursed with the tongue of the cannibal." They nod again and Andrew walked outside for some air. Alex walked up next to him and said, "Thank you again for saving me, but why?" Andrew sat down on the ground and said, "Because you're special." Alex looked at him and blushed. Andrew stood up and walked to a tree and stood there just staring at it. The wind blew the leaves behind him and his long singed black hair was blown to the left of him. A tear fell from his eye and he continued to stare at the grey-colored sky. "You see, my family, they're dead because of me. I killed them myself, ate them and left only their skeletons. It happened when I was 5 years old. 12 years ago to be precise." Andrew stated. "That's when EJ saved me. This is my family now." Andrew adds as another tear fell from his eyes. Alex walked up to him, he beautiful golden.